This over here is Intel's latest i5 processor. Actually, i5 is probably a bit of a blasphemy for Intel because now it's called Core Ultra 5 245K. This is the new best i5 that you can get. And do you know what? i5 is actually very, very powerful these days. So the question I have is how good is this i5 245K against the 14600K? Because that's Intel's 14th gen, last generation. And how good is it against the AMD's 7800X 3D? One of the best gaming CPUs that are out there. But if you expect to see gaming benchmarks in here, sorry to disappoint you. We're going to be taking a look at how these perform for creators and how much improvement do we actually get from the last generation. Let's find out. This part of the video is brought to you by Trike's Panorama, the world's first CPU cooler with curved L-shaped AMOLED screen. It's not just for good looks though, the cooling is amazing. Go check out our video how we were able to overclock the Intel Core Ultra 9 285K with this exact cooler, and that was not even maxing the cooling performance. Go check out our hands-on and cooling performance with the Panorama in the video description below. I have been trying to work with AMD to get actually the Ryzen 9000 samples, but just so you know, AMD works a little bit differently behind the scenes, or seems like AMD doesn't have as many samples as Intel, which makes it look like some channels are Intel biased, but it's just because they don't have AMD samples, even though AMD CPUs can sometimes, and sometimes most of the times, outperform Intel CPUs. So AMD, please, can we get some Ryzen 9000 samples so we can actually showcase the audience how good is the 9000 against the Core Ultra. Okay, now the specs comparison, which can be a little bit boring sometimes, but if you look closely enough, you can actually see where they have gained the performance. As you can see, the max turbo frequency has gone down 100 megahertz. Also, what's gone down is the threads. Now we have 14 core and 14 thread CPU, which is 8 P cores plus 6 E cores. The P cores don't have multi-threading anymore. But then we look at the base frequency, and that's where we see the most boost in terms of specs. From 3.5 gigahertz on the 14600K to 4.2 gigahertz, that is 700 megahertz boost. If you look at the E core base frequency, that has actually improved by 1 gigahertz. From 2.6 to 3.6 gigahertz, that's really amazing. And as you'll see in a minute from the benchmarks, the E cores are the actual key factor where Intel got most of their performance from. Another thing that has changed is the PCIe lanes. Now we have 24 lanes, not just 20, so we're matching AMD. No more DDR4 support, and we've also increased the cache size. The max turbo power is roughly around 125 watts base, and then the turbo is 159 according to Intel, but I have found slightly different results in a minute. The iGPU has also been improved, which is not the UHD 770 anymore, but is Intel Xe graphics, kind of, that comes from the last generation mobile CPUs, but that is now on the CPU as well. Now, interestingly, Intel is actually using TSMC's node. And if you look at Intel's ARC website, you can actually see that Intel is trying to hide this a little bit. Looking from 14th gen, you can see that the lithography is right on the top with all the other specs of Intel. You know, they see the release date, and then the lithography is there saying Intel 7, for example. But now that lithography line has actually been moved further down, so it's kind of like hidden between the specs, and we're just using TSMC. So if a client comes to Intel and says, so what wafer are you actually using to make your chips? Intel's like, TSMC. So apparently, until Intel can resort to their own A18, I think this is their own wafer, they're going to their competitor TSMC and buying the wafer from there and then actually making the chips, which is slightly alarming to me because now TSMC is making their chips for all the markets. If you want to check out the latest pricing for these CPUs, check them out in the video description below. But also, I highly recommend checking out the Core Ultra 9 review that I did recently, because there I'll go a little bit more in depth about certain things and certain aspects of the CPU that I'm not going to do in this video, just to keep this a little bit more condensed. In terms of the Testbench setup, which is very, very important, what I'm doing slightly differently than basically all the other channels out there, and what also Intel is recommending me to do, but I'm like, Nah, that's not right. So we've got AMD AM5 platform, we've got Intel LGA 1700 platform, and we have the Core Ultra platform. In terms of motherboards, AMD is getting the X870E ProArt Creative Wi-Fi, Intel is getting the ASRock Z90 PG Nova, and the Core Ultra is getting Gigabyte Z890 Aorus Elite X Ice. All of them are using RTX 4090s, and the operating system and the project drive have been separated, and I'm using a Samsung 980 Pro for the project drive. All the platforms are using 360mm AIO for the best optimal cooling, and we're using the Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut thermal paste, making sure that all the heat gets transferred very well from the IHS to the cooler, and the CPUs are nice and cool. But the biggest difference is in RAM speeds. I am actually using the memory speed of the stock settings what Intel or AMD is providing for their platform, which means 12th gen is 4800, 13th and 14th gen are 5600 megatransfers per second, Ryzen 7000 is 5200 megatransfers per second, Ryzen 9000 is 5600 megatransfers per second. The Core Ultra is 6400 megatransfers per second. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about the IMC and the way this Core Ultra actual platform with memory controller works, check out the Core Ultra 9 review. So first, about the memory controller. The thing is, there's a little bit of an asterisk to this, and I'll go a little bit deeper in the Core Ultra 9, but I want to mention this in this video as well, because that is very, very important. The more DIMMs you populate onto your motherboard, whether there's 2 or 4, the harder this is for the memory controller, and the official memory support actually goes down in speed. That's why we have the little asterisks. But the Core Ultra 9 or the Core Ultra 200S series CPU lineup is actually even more complicated than the previous generation, because they have introduced a new RAM stick that you can get, a CU DIMM, which also has different kind of memory speeds supported officially on different things. And the interesting thing is, Intel on their briefing and on the review guys actually says that their sweet spot is roughly around 8000 megahertz, which is ridiculous speed. But the thing is, that is actually out of their own spec that they say on their website. So I am testing them on the base spec setup that I have on the website. I've got 64 gigabytes of Kingston Fury Renegade, 64 gigabytes of RAM. This is not a CU DIMM actually, this is a normal UDIMM, which actually also is in theory out of the stock settings, but it's completely fine for this test bench setup to actually showcase the different generations of CPUs and their memory controllers and how the speed relates to that. If you want to overclock, go check out the Core Ultra 9 review if you want to learn out more. Now, power consumption, because this is one of the main things that Intel was mentioning and highlighting and emphasizing in their briefing. The 245K is pulling 135 watt from the socket when Intel stock settings have been applied. By stock settings, I mean the performance profile, because now Intel has different performance profiles for the CPUs, and not all of them are available for every CPU. For example, the Core Ultra 9 has 3: base, performance, and extreme. The Core Ultra 5 only has base and performance, which just moves the PL1 and PL2 limits about a little bit, which means basically a little bit more power in the, extreme or performance profiles, and a little bit more conservative power on the base profiles. But I am testing them in the Intel specs, but the highest performance Intel specs. If you want to see what's the difference in all of these different profiles, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, because that video is coming out very soon. You don't want to miss that. Intel is actually saying that this CPU should be pulling more than 135 watts. Officially, it should be pulling 159 watts, but I'm never seeing that being pulled. And that was the same case with the 14600K. I never saw the 181 watts that Intel was saying pulled. We're only seeing 167 on 14600K, which is 23.7% more power than the Core Ultra 5 245K. The 7800X3D is pulling 89 watts from the socket, which is 34% less than Intel. That's quite impressive. So now, looking at the Cinebench R24 and the ultimate CPU performance, we can see that the 14600K is about 8.3% slower in single core score and about 9.3% slower in the multi-core score, which is very impressive because of the power consumption. Remember, we were about 24% lower power consumption, but about 10% higher in performance, which is really nice results, what we want to see. The 7800X 3D is about 16.5% slower in the single core score, but about 27% slower in the multi-core score. Now bear in mind, the Ryzen 7000 is actually competing with Intel's 12th gen, which is a little bit older. So what I have here from AMD is actually an older CPU, and I wish I had a Ryzen 9000, but I'm hoping that soon we can update these as well. Geekbench 6, the 14600K is about 5.5% slower in single core score and about 4.6% slower in multi-core score. The X3D is 9.3% to 18.4% slower in the single and multi-core scores. Now, in terms of the iGPU, if you want to see the performance difference, go check out the Core Ultra 9 video. In terms of Photoshop and actual benchmarks now for creators, the 14600K is 1.4% faster in overall Photoshop score compared to the 245K. What's going on in here? Well, looks like actual real-world performance, we're not gaining that much. And the 7800X 3D is 5.4% faster. So the AMD, which is quite old CPU, actually wins compared to the Core Ultra, which is a lot newer, like years newer CPU. And Intel's always been the dominating force in Photoshop as long as I can remember, but now the table seems to be turning. Moving on to Cinebench for Lightroom Classic, and we can see an interesting story and pattern develop. The 14600K is basically on par with the 245K. Active score is 11.3% faster, but the passive is about 4.8% slower. The 7800X 3D is about 15% slower in the overall scores. So kind of on par with the Core Ultra, but a little bit faster than AMD. Moving on to video editing and Adobe Premiere Pro. The 14600K is only about 3 to 5% slower in the extended and standard overall scores. Now that is kind of not impressive at all. Bear in mind the RAM frequency is actually 800 megahertz faster on the Core Ultra compared to the 14600K. And if you see the long GOP scores, the 14600K is actually 6% faster. Now, I do believe that there's some kind of a driver error, even though I'm using the latest driver, but because of the improved iGPU on the Core Ultra 200 series, I would have assumed that the long GOP is actually better because of the improved hardware on the iGPU. The 7800X 3D is about 16 to 17% slower in the extended and standard overall scores. Moving on to Cinebench for After Effects, the 14600K is basically on par with the 245K. The GPU score, yes, is a little bit faster, but overall score, we're kind of the same. In fact, the 14600K kind of looks slightly faster. The 7800X 3D is about 6.7% slower in the overall score. So Ryzen is not falling that much behind. Next off, Cinebench for DaVinci Resolve, and the 14600K is about 5.5% faster in the overall score. That's standard, extended is slightly less, and the basic is 0.5% faster. And that's because the basic is using the free version of DaVinci Resolve, meaning that, you know, some of the hardware is not utilized and the actual PC is capped what it can do. But most importantly, the long GOP score is 34% faster on the 14600K in standard scores and 21.7% faster in the extended score, which just kind of starts to make me think that there's some kind of a driver issue or the software can't fully utilize the new iGPU that is on the Core 200S series. The Ryzen is about 3.5 to 6.7% slower in the overall scores and doesn't actually fall behind that much from the Intel side. And now 3D rendering, and firstly Blender. The 14600K is about 3.7% slower in the monster scene, 2% faster in the junk shop scene, and about 7.3% slower in the classroom scene. So we can see that the 245K has actually improved its 3D performance and lower the wattage, which is really good news. The Ryzen is about 14 to 18% slower in these rendering scenes. So Intel seems to have very strong hand in 3D rendering, and it's the same story here in V-Ray. The 14600K is about 5.7% slower, and the 7800X 3D is about 19% slower. So Intel seems to have quite a strong hand in when it comes to just CPU rendering. In terms of efficiency though, AMD still seems to be holding quite a strong hand, because if you remember, it was using a lot less power compared to these Intel CPUs. So in conclusion, what has actually changed, and is it worth upgrading to the 245K? What is Intel thinking? What's going on? Firstly, this is Intel's new generation of CPUs, and that's why the name has changed as well, because they have changed a lot architecturally. They've turned a whole new page that the 14th gen couldn't develop to anymore. That was the end of that architecture. That's it. Now we have tile-based CPU. They're splashing together and gluing together different parts of different things. It's a lot more efficient in terms of producing them, which should be cheaper for us to buy, which is all good news. And I can't wait to see how far they can take this. But right now, at this point, there's a little bit bad news, which is that the 14600K doesn't actually look that bad yet. And the new generation definitely doesn't seem like a worthy upgrade when you are on the 12, 13, 14th gen. So the Core Ultra 200S is kind of for people who are on the 11th gen or before to jump into the new platform. So to me, the best bang for buck CPU for creators right now is the Intel LGA 1700 platform. And I was right about that 2 months ago, or even more, when I was actually making and published my best bang for buck creator PC guide, which you can find in the video description below in every single video. And that always leads you to the latest build guides. And there I'm explaining what I would do as the latest best bang for buck creator PC. And now, because the Core Ultra 200S series is out, the previous generation kind of is even more affordable. Hopefully Intel will lower the pricing and doesn't keep it up just to make you buy the Core Ultra 200S series. There is one more thing that is changed on the Core Ultra 200S series, which is the iGPU that Intel is pushing and is saying that this is the first CPU that supports hardware acceleration on the new Sony XAVC H codec. Now, I asked Intel about it because this was not actually in any of the briefings, any of the materials, because people think this is not important. For me, that's very important, because they're saying that now suddenly we have hardware acceleration for some new codecs that Sony has added to their lineup. But the good news for you is that the same codec is now actually supported on all of the iGPUs from Intel's 11th gen. So even if you've got a CPU from the 11th gen that it has got the iGPU, not an F variant, remember that, then the same codec is supported all throughout the series until the Core Ultra 200S, which kind of is not making the Core 200S even more appealing. It just says that the previous generation also supports that. So that's kind of nothing new for creators on the iGPU side. Now, comparing Intel to AMD, if you're doing video editing and photo editing and you're not touching a lot of H.264 or 5 codecs, I think AMD has also got a very solid option, because their AM5 platform seems to be supporting a lot of different CPUs, and the upgrade path seems to be a little bit more healthier compared to Intel, even though Intel releases actually more CPUs for the same platform, if that makes sense. AMD has really upped the game. In photo editing, AMD is basically better now. In video editing, Intel is better if you're using the iGPU and you're actually utilizing the hardware acceleration playback, then Intel is right up there. But if not, AMD seems very, very tempting. So AMD, please, can we actually review all these CPUs so we can fully show them which one is better to make you make the best purchasing decision for your creator PC? So I'm left with this. Nice to see new things and all the new architecture and new direction that Intel is pushing, but right now the performance doesn't seem as impressive, which is kind of the same story that you saw some of the other reviewers talk about Ryzen 9000. So have we reached the peak of how and where technology can develop, and now we're just gonna slap AI on everything and do AI stuff? I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Thanks guys for watching.